Good afternoon and welcome to the Center for New American Security conference session on declassification of intelligence information in connection with the current war in Ukraine. I'm Carrie Cordero, a senior fellow here at CNAS. Leading up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, the United States declassified and proactively released information about what was about to happen. In the days leading up to the invasion, both President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken publicly said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the information available to the U.S. government revealed in the invasion was about to happen. They also communicated that Russia was seeking a pretext, what was often described in news reports as a false flag, to justify the invasion. And just a couple days before the invasion, they communicated that Putin had in fact made a decision to go forward. These statements, an advance warning from the highest levels of the United States government, didn't have the effect of preventing the invasion and the war itself, but they certainly had the effect of putting the world on notice. It was a very high degree of transparency about what intelligence sources were revealing. And it wasn't just shared with allies and international partners, it was shared publicly with the world. A strong argument can be made that this level of transparency preempted Putin's efforts to shape the narrative surrounding the early days of the war, at least in the parts of the world that have access to uncensored news and information. To discuss these recent events and the implications for the U.S. intelligence community, international partnerships, and the role that foreign intelligence plays in protecting U.S. and allied interests around the world, I am joined by former intelligence community leaders and true experts on this issue. The first guest to join me is Lieutenant General Bob Ashley, who I will be welcoming into the conversation. We also expect to be joined by former Director of National Intelligence, Jim Clapper. We're working on some technical issues, but hopefully he'll be able to join the conversation soon. General Ashley, welcome, and I want to give the audience some background for your experience and expertise. General Ashley retired from the U.S. Army in 2020 after over 36 years of active duty service as an intelligence officer. He was the 21st director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, and formerly served as the Army Deputy Chief of Staff, G2, where he was senior advisor to the Secretary of the Army and the Army Chief of Staff for all aspects of intelligence, counterintelligence, and security. He's commanded at the company, battalion, squadron, and brigade levels with 6 combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He also had key intelligence assignments throughout his career, including with the United States Army Joint Special Operations Command, the United States Central Command, the International Security Assistance Force and Director of Intelligence, and among others, the United States Army Intelligence Center. He serves as an adjunct senior fellow with us here at CNAS. And General Ashley, I'm delighted to have you kick off this conversation with me, given the recent events and the role that intelligence has played as the war in Ukraine has unfolded. I thought we would start out with the current events, and given your prior role as director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, I was hoping that you could help us start off by helping our audience understand how you think intelligence community leaders and administration policymakers thought through the decision to declassify information right as they were in the days and weeks leading up to the Russian invasion. What are the types of things that they would have been thinking about, and how would you have been thinking about these things back when you were in the leadership role at DIA?
Yeah, Carrie, thanks for the question, and thanks for the opportunity to be with CNAS today for this forum. You kind of gave a good stage setter or scene setter initially with your comments. As you go into these kinds of conversations about what are you going to disclose, it's not the intel community's decision. It really is senior policymakers. In this case, it's the president who's making a decision of whether or not they're going to disclose sensitive information. What you want to be able to do is to tell those senior leaders what's the risk. So you've seen lots of articles that come out after this and say, hey, we put sources and methods at risk. Well, unless you were in the room when the decision was made, you probably don't really understand what sources and methods were involved and whether or not they actually were at risk. And so what you want to lay out for decision makers is, if there is risk, this is what we think it is, and that you've got to take a look at the near-term decision to disclose information juxtaposed against that placement and access further down the road. So in other words, I've got some information, I want to maybe put it in a public domain, and what counsel you get from the intelligence community is go, okay, here's what we think the level of risk is, that source may be cut off, and if that's the case, here's what you potentially lose down the road. Is losing that access to information in the future worth what you think you will gain from the disclosure? And that's kind of the equation that everybody has to go through. And there are senior people that are in these conversations that have a lot of experience. And so you're getting the best advice from some very senior counsel across government in those situations. And then ultimately the decision comes down to one person, whether or not they're willing to do that. The other part of this, and I think it's really important, is there are no absolutes in this. So some of the criticism could be, well, you disclosed information, you were hoping to deter, it didn't necessarily deter. There's a really complicated fabric in terms of, from my understanding as I'm watching this as a private citizen, of who really was the intent for the message, and whether there was an intent for deterrence or if it was really building cohesion across NATO and other allies. And so you have to really understand that aspect of it as well. Because what the IC tries to do is reduce uncertainty, because there's no exact, these are not binary kinds of actions where you have absolutes. It is about reducing uncertainty and helping senior leaders understand, mitigate, and manage risk.
Thanks for that. So that's a great way to start us off. Tell us a little bit, so in terms of our, I know folks watching, some we might have former ICers or current folks in the intelligence community, the national security community. We also might have some folks who don't have as much exposure. Can you explain a little bit from your position as former DIA director, how does DIA fit into this picture? So what's the role specifically of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and how would it be informing these policymaker decisions?
So the core mission for the Defense Intelligence Agency is that we provide foundational and an understanding of the operational environment. And I kind of like to use a sports analogy when somebody says, what's your mission? I said, well, okay, let me give you a football analogy. I will tell you everything about the town in which you're going to go and play the game, and I'm going to tell you everything about the team that you're about ready to take on. And so that's kind of really DIA's role. It's a lot more complicated than that, but that's kind of the simple look at it. So we provide that foundational understanding of what that military is capable of doing. And, one of the things that's really difficult is intent. To the degree that we can, we try to make sure we are able to, provide policy advisors and senior leaders and understand of intent along with capabilities, because capabilities alone is not exactly going to be a full measure of what potentially could take place.
So the capabilities question is really interesting, and that's something that has come up more as it relates to the war in Ukraine. There was sort of the initial declassification and very proactive release of public information about the fact that the invasion was going to happen. And then now that we are several months into this war, there's been more information discussed in the public commentary regarding how the assessments were done of how the Russian forces would fight. That seems to me to probably be even more so into the DIA lane of the intelligence community role. So how would you, if you put your former director hat on, how would you be thinking about these current assessments, and what's the obligation of DIA to be informing policymakers, and is there any consideration of a role in terms of informing beyond policymakers, the world, allies, partners, about the capabilities of, in terms of especially that team aspect? Who's the team? What's the capabilities of the team that you're going to be, the Ukrainians in this case, are up against?
Yeah, so a couple of things there. One, let me go to will, because that's probably the center piece of the discussion that we've seen come out over the last couple of months, where it's one thing to enumerate pieces of equipment, but it's another thing to understand will. We have a sense from looking at the Russians that there were morale issues. We knew there were drug problems. We knew there were recruiting problems. We knew there were health issues, and we had written about this in the past, and so those were in existence. What's kind of one of those intangibles, because like I said before, you're trying to reduce uncertainty. And intelligence is both an art and a science in terms of how we put those assessments together. And so our ability to measure will is something that I think the IC is looking hard at now, and how do we do that? One of the things I think it's important is, we're a learning organization, so if there's something that we feel that we need to shore up, or, kind of look at our lessons learned, it's how do we measure will? How do we understand that? And a lot of times that's information that comes from human. And so, the most traditional and the oldest of intelligence disciplines is human intelligence, because that's the one thing that's going to be able to get you up close and have an understanding of the individuals that are behind the decisions, to understand intent, and in some cases to get a sense of will. And so I would not be surprised if the IC, if not, DIA by extension, as part of that team, is taking a hard look at how do we measure will? And how do we take will and couple it against all the capabilities are there to get a real sense of, how do we think this is going to play out? And so we have to take, the scenario that transpired on the 24th through, the first 4 or 5 days to get a sense of, okay, well, we thought, the assessments were a couple of days, they're going to be in Kyiv, and, the Russians would be in charge. Not exactly how that played out. So I think we have to go back and look at our own methodologies, our tradecraft, and how do we look at will, and how do we apply kind of the art behind that. But there's also, you have to look at collection.
Welcome back. This is Carrie Cordero with the Center for New American Security, and I am joined by General Ashley, and we are also joined now by former Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, who I'm delighted to join this conversation. If you weren't with us before, we are continuing our conversation on the role of declassifying intelligence and the role of that in the current war in Ukraine. As I was discussing before the break with General Ashley, there are a number of risks and considerations that need to go into the decision-making process of policymakers in declassifying information, particularly as it relates to this current conflict. We were also discussing General Ashley's experience as former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency and the role that DIA plays in terms of informing policymakers and leaders in the national security community regarding adversaries' abilities and capabilities on the battlefield. So I'm delighted to welcome also Jim Clapper to this conversation. I will keep introductions brief, but as our audience may know, he was the 4th and longest serving Director of National Intelligence, has an extremely distinguished career of approximately 40 years of service to our country in many, many senior intelligence roles, including DNI, Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, and a very long career in the armed forces, both from dating from the 1960s through 1995, and then he returned to government service in senior intelligence leadership roles after the September 11th, 2001 attack. So Director Clapper, I'm delighted that you were able to join the conversation, and I think I will turn to you first. We were speaking before the break, General Ashley and I, about the considerations that go into deciding whether to declassify information as it was leading up to the days right before the Russian invasion into Ukraine. As the war progressed over the next several months, there have been additional efforts to provide greater transparency. So it wasn't just about the very first invasion. It also has been an ongoing effort on the part of the Biden administration and some of our international partners as well, to be more transparent. I'll give you one example. General Nakasone, the head of US Cybercom, recently confirmed that the US is engaged in offensive, defensive, and information operations in support of Ukraine. So that is a very new and very specific thing that he released in a public and transparent way. I want to come to you from your vantage point as former director of national intelligence, which of course oversees the entire intelligence community. How have you been thinking about the declassifications that you've seen as it connects to the war in Ukraine, given all of the work that you put into increasing transparency about intelligence activities during your tenure?
Well, I think Bob did hear some of the previous conversation. I think Bob highlighted the consideration here. From an intelligence perspective, it's always about sources and methods. And there are other, and then you have to weigh that against the gain. And the gain could be in terms of public diplomacy, persuading allies what the facts are, diming out the adversary, and all three of those purposes were served in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I personally am all for it. I think traditionally the intelligence community has probably been too conservative about and hasn't been as transparent as it could be. And in turn, actually be more effective. So I think there's, I'm all for what the current administration has done. The FAQ I get, frequently asked question, is, well, why didn't the incompetent DNI do that in 2014 when the Russians invaded the first time? Well, some things have changed. First, the Russians were a lot more subtle in 2014. They're about as subtle as a freight train this time. The technology is profoundly improved in 8 years that we have to use for to expose to the public or to allies or to adversaries for that matter. And I think there's a realization that the US has to play in the information operations space a lot more aggressively than we have in the past.
So, Director Clapper, you mentioned that you have been a supporter and you have been a real facilitator of intelligence transparency, and I want to give our audience a little bit of context for how those policies changed, in particular under your tenure. So it was after the disclosures of Edward Snowden in 2013 that you directed the development of what are called principles of intelligence transparency. And so this was something new for the intelligence community because it really had the community put on paper, here's the things that we're going to consider, here's the guidelines, here's the principles that we're going to go by to make decisions about declassifying information. A lot of those principles and the way that they were implemented in the ensuing years had to do with how the intelligence community works. So legal authorities, policies, procedures, things like that. But there was one of them that talks about being proactive and clear in information publicly available, including affirmative steps to provide, and I'm reading from the principles, provide timely transparency on matters of public interest. And that's a really broad and general category. And so just coming back to you, Director Clapper, I'm curious as to your thoughts now that you're looking back on that work that you did back then and putting those policies in place. Is this current transparency, is this what you and the colleagues that you were working with at the time, is this how you guys envisioned transparency playing out? Or do you feel that the transparency we've seen surrounding the war in Ukraine is something different because it's more about what the intelligence community is actually learning? I mean, it's really the meat of what the business is. I
think your question captures that. There are actually, in my mind at least, two bins here. There is the how-to, the processes and procedures that intelligence uses. And the point there, and what motivated this, post-Snowden, was to assure the public that what the intelligence community is doing is legal, moral, and ethical. There has always been an aura of suspicion around the intelligence community. In fact, any part of the government that does things in secrecy is going to be suspect. That's just human nature. So the extent that we can, clear the air, remove some of the fog, and remove some of the mystery, it's to the better. Now, it's different, I think. The other bin is releasing or declassifying substantive information about what the Russians are going to do, or diming out a false flag operation, or whatever it may be. That's a different category, but I think the principle is the same, and it is in both cases a positive thing that the intelligence community use the phrase comes out of the shadows to the extent that it can safely.
Hey, Carrie, if I could add on to that real quick before we go further, is what Director Clapper talked about, that transparency. For me, there's another word that starts with a T, it's trust. And coming out of something like Snowden, you want to make sure that if you're investing this money in this intelligence community, that there is a high level of trust. And really for me, the value proposition behind the IC it rests on, I think, 3 pillars. One is that we take an oath to the Constitution, so there's that duty that we're bound to do the right thing. The second is, from a politicization standpoint, we're agnostic to the decision, right? We're presenting information, we're presenting assessments, we're providing an understanding and reducing uncertainty. So we're not inclined to drive it, the assessment in a certain direction. We grade ourselves on that every year. Matter of fact, the DNI looks at all the publications from the various organizations to see whether or not we've been political. So we have oversight that grades ourselves. And then the third part of that is transparency. So we have tradecraft. We talk to you about sources and methods, and at the classified level, we talk about risk, we talk about confidence levels. And so those 3 pillars are really kind of the value proposition of the IC, but underpinning what, Director Clapper started years ago was, we've got to make sure that we never lose the trust of the American people.
So I want to come back, General Ashley, to that politicization issue in a minute. But before we do that, you both have mentioned in the discussion so far the issue of sources and methods, which obviously is the issue that from intelligence community practitioners' perspective and the traditions of the intelligence community is the things that we're trying to protect, and the risk calculation that goes on whenever there are questions of whether something should be declassified and released. But I want to focus for a minute on how the declassification decisions don't just necessarily affect, one of the calculations is sources and methods, but another might be how international partnerships and our working relationships with our foreign service partners, the United States government's foreign service partners, are affected. So Director Ashley, or General Ashley, let me start with you. While we're focusing on declassifying, can you speak to how intelligence sharing is done between nations and some of the considerations that going into that? Because the decisions that the United States government is making doesn't just affect us. Obviously, we're making declassification decisions that affect the Ukrainians. We're making declassification discussions that affect NATO and other interests in the region. So can you speak to how these intelligence partnerships work in the normal course of business, which will help us understand a little bit the calculations that go into effect when we're in this crisis situation?
Yeah, so I think there's always this sense that these are really multilateral relationships. They are, but when you look at the policy and what's put in place, they're really bilateral. So, even though NATO has 30 some odd nations and you have different relationships and sharing, you have a lot of bilateral relationships. And for me, you kind of look at this as if there's something that you're looking to disclose, do you own that information? And if you don't own the information, you really have to go back to kind of the host nation that does and have a conversation. Are they willing to allow that to be disclosed? And, whether they see that as undue risk letting that information out. So these are, really bilateral relationships and conversations. It's almost like a duty to warn if you're going to put something out, because you don't want to put their sources and methods at risk, and you want to get their approval in the process of going through that decision making. And so that as we look at how the decisions are made internal to the US government, expand that out to multiple governments and those relationships of having those conversations. And in some cases, you may find that nations aren't as concerned or sensitive about particular pieces of information that may be disclosed, and they may be more, more willing or more forthcoming to allow information out. But there is an ongoing dialogue because these are national policies that we have with nations. And when information is shared with us that goes into our overall intelligence production, it comes with some caveats that we've got to stay, linked to them about what we do with that information.
Director Clapper, how do you think the current intelligence transparency with respect to the war is being received by our close intelligence sharing partners? Do you think that, do you think all these declassifications are well coordinated with them in advance, or do you think the declassifications might affect those partnerships in ways that we might not be thinking about yet?
Well, in the case of the prediction about the Russians invading, I think that was done to influence partners, since there were doubting Thomases or skeptics that didn't think they would invade. So as I understand it, the administration made a decision to publicize the U.S. assessment, which was that the Russians would invade in an effort to persuade them. I think generally, to answer your question, Carrie, they're supportive. In fact, and I would cite particularly the Five Eyes members, most notably the UK. I cannot remember an instance where the director of the GCHQ, which is the UK equivalent of NSA, spoke publicly about substantive intelligence issues, which he did in the case of this invasion. So I think that's an indicative of how allies feel about using intelligence as a weapon, and that's what we're really talking about here.
General Ashley, do you share that view in terms of the way that the intelligence is being used? Director Clapper said it's being used as a weapon. How do you think about that framing in terms of the risks of politicization that you mentioned before? How can the administration sort of walk this line in terms of using the information affirmatively to affect events and affect the world's understanding of the situation without it gaining that label of being politicized?
Yeah, I think the critical point there is that the information is provided is truthful, as it exists, so that the information is not segmented, it's not piecemealed, it's not turned in such a way to kind of deceive the recipients of the actual understanding. So as long as it remains truthful to what the intelligence community has produced, I don't have any issues with that. Information is released with the intent to inform, and information, as Director Clapper spoke to, is also released with the intent to influence. And so there's a couple categories there. From an IC standpoint, this is the assessment, this is our understanding, and so that's the information that you have. Then once you get into policy, it's okay, what do you want to do with it? The key thing is that you keep the integrity of the information, the probity of what has been provided by the IC, and you do not manipulate that part of it.
And who's
I think classically, if I could add to that, Carrie, normally when you use the term politicization, that is typically in a domestic context rather than a foreign context. I suppose you could say that using intelligence as we have and publicizing or declassifying intelligence, I guess you could say that's a form of politicization in an international context. But I think there, at least in my mind, there's a distinction here between the domestic use, the domestic impact of intelligence and how it's used or misused versus internationally.
Yeah, that's a great point in terms of that's when we start thinking about things that are when intelligence is being abused in some ways, then it's being used for domestic political purposes, something like that. as opposed to this role of intelligence information informing world events and informing the decisions and the actions of both the U.S. and governments around the world to deal with a particular acute issue. Do you think that, and this is for either one of you, do you think that there is a difference in how either the administration, not necessarily this one, but a administration or the intelligence community thinks about the declassification of this kind of information that is different in wartime versus in sort of the everyday order or peacetime, if we sort of get back to that? Is there a difference in how the intelligence community or an administration should be thinking about it? Or are there sort of different considerations when it's a wartime situation versus the peacetime situation?
Well, I'll start and Bob can jump in. I think there classically has been a difference in a tactical context. In other words, in a combat situation, we've always loosened or made exceptions to the rules and been far more liberal about sharing of intelligence, and appropriately so. Now, the question one might ask is, well, why do we make an exception in wartime? Why don't we just behave that way consistently, wartime or peacetime, which is a good question. And I think that's that factor, that realization, particular experience in Iraq and especially Afghanistan, where we've, in the latter case, been operating in a coalition context, places a great premium on sharing, and we found all kinds of ways, and Bob can speak to this from personal experience, having deployed out there, all kinds of ways that we found to share intelligence on a timely basis. And I think when the impetus or the motivation is lives are at risk, that can serve to break down the bureaucratic rules.
Jennifer Ashley, how do you think about the differences in the two different scenarios, whether it's peacetime or wartime decision making?
Give me 15 seconds to go to your last question on the politicization piece. That's why transparency to the IC is important, so that we're not defending ourselves after the fact, that you understand what the IC's role is, so you realize, that it is the factual presentation of information. I think it shouldn't be different. The challenge, and Director Clapper alluded to this, if I were in Iraq and Afghanistan, I had the ability to share a lot more information in a combat zone than I did in peacetime. And I've had close partner nations after I come back, say things, and I'm paraphrasing, say, when we were in a combat zone, we had much greater sharing capability. One of my steady drumbeats is I think we've kind of had a Cold War mentality in terms of intel sharing, and is carried forward, and it really is about risk. And our Five Eyes partners, who are tremendous about reminding us of not the risk of sharing, but the risk of not sharing. So much so that Vince Stewart, when he was the director of DIA, said, I'm going to put a Commonwealth officer, a two-star general, as a deputy director for Commonwealth integration, so that every day I see a foreign partner walking down the hallway at DI going, are you doing everything you should to share? And kind of my steady drumbeat, it has been, why are we waiting for the first shot to be fired to develop the muscle memory that we need to put in place for how we're going to do it? And so as we move into a conflict, then I hate to say we're on the fly, and we put those processes in place, and we get the techniques, tactics, and procedures done rather quickly. But one is we're waiting for the crisis before we start putting that in place. And matter of fact, there's probably some things and some insights that we could garner through sharing with some of these partner nations that would help us maybe preclude conflict, not always, and not saying that that's the case in Ukraine, but I do know that some of the bilateral relationships we've got with some of our East European partners that I experienced are just some tremendous intelligence producers and some great professionals, not only within the Five Eyes, but actually well beyond the Five Eyes. And so I think we have to think a little more seriously about what can be shared and what can be gained through a more robust sharing relationship, as opposed to waiting for the first shot to be fired.
I could add to that, Carrie. intentionally went public within the IC, advocating that we completely do away with the no foreign dissemination restrictions that we now have with the Five Eyes, and simply extend dual citizenship privileges and obligations whenever we're in each other's intelligence footprint. That in turn would allow another group of nations to sort of fall in what is now the space occupied by what we call the second parties, that is the Five Eyes Alliance. And there's another group of nations out there that we should, I think, have a relationship that is on a par with or parallel to what we now have with the Five Eyes. And this is just the general trend towards, I think, international sharing, the impetus for which began, I think, with the mutual recognition of terrorism as a common threat.
Well, certainly in the counterterrorism aspect, there's been the international terrorism arena for the past 20 years has been very, very close sharing. One does wonder if in this current war, if it got to the situation where the United States felt compelled, and I'm just sort of wondering out loud here, the United States felt compelled to release information about the invasion publicly, was that because information hadn't yet been shared adequately at the intelligence levels, or was it more, I think, as Director Clapper, you were describing earlier, more to be able to affect in a public way policymakers of other countries, leadership of other countries, actions? And
I don't know. I suspect the latter. I think this had more to do with public diplomacy, frankly, than because I think the capable intelligence services that were watching the situation in Ukraine probably had already concluded that. But by going public with it, by the U.S. intelligence community declassifying their assessment, I think this served to put some pressure on the policymaking community in other communities, in other countries, even though the intelligence apparatus of each of those countries had probably reached the same conclusion.
I want to ask you both about how just the nature of intelligence has changed, certainly throughout each of your careers in the intelligence business, and then since you both have left government. One of the most striking examples that's relevant to the current war is the use of open source technologies, in particular satellite information. Director Clapper, you were very involved in the development of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. General Ashley, in your capacity as DIA, certainly have experience with the technology aspects of intelligence collection. We got an audience question, and I think this is a really important issue. General Ashley, maybe I'll start with you. Do you think, with respect to open source intelligence, the information that is just out in the public domain, in particular through commercial satellites, is that really changing the way that the intelligence community needs to think about transparency? Because there's just all this information out there that is informing the media, that is informing the research community. And so in some ways, information confirmed by the US government is really, one might think it's a step behind in terms of the information that might already be out there through commercial sources. How do you think about the role that open source information, in particular the satellites, are playing in the current situation and the decisions on declassification?
I mean, I think it's driving us toward a greater degree of transparency, but it's also enabling us in the context of transparency because, think about, I think it was President Carter that, said NRO exists as an organization. That was policy when he decided to disclose that back in the 70s. So rather than having to take some of the pristine, sensitive imagery that NGA and the NRO produce, you can package up unclassified information and provide it to partners. And so the other part of that is, when you're looking at that, you look at the information, obviously the picture, the veracity of that, you probably have classified holdings that tell you that this in fact is what's transpired, and you have an understanding based on really a more wholesome, all-source understanding in the classified realm. So it allows you to kind of couple the two of those and put out more at the unclassified level, you know, to the public, to partner nations that you may not have a very robust sharing relationship with. So I think it's a huge enabler. Matter of fact, I think NGA is probably the best example, and because it's a very specific discipline, I think it's a little bit easier to do. But I know Admiral Sharp and, you know, Trey Whitworth, now the current director, have really embraced this. Matter of fact, what Bob Sharp did was he kind of extended to the commercial industry tasking. So he brought them into the tasking and the production piece of this. So it allows us to get more information out, not only for public consumption, but to share with partners. And it's something we're going to have to embrace. Complexity lies in some of the broader open source stuff from an all source standpoint, and how we ensure the, you know, the confidence levels in it. And we think about tradecraft, but there's an integration, a relationship that we're just going to have to build on, because there's just so much of it out there. We need to leverage it.
The use of the open source actually makes it safer and less risky for the declassification of classified information. You have that umbrella, if you will, of you know, literally and figuratively, classified overhead reconnaissance or unclassified commercial imagery. You know, that's a great umbrella, if you will, or protection, you know, for the declassification of classified information.
So we've been talking a lot about the benefits of transparency and the ways that the U.S. intelligence community is moving forward to be more transparent. Some of this open source information, in particular the satellites, playing a role in that. But there are downsides. And so I want to take a minute for us to explore a little bit what that might look like. There was one report that came out, there has been a report, excuse me, that has come out, one in particular that was from the New York Times, that was alleging that U.S. intelligence was, and I'm quoting the New York Times report, helping Ukraine kill Russian generals, unquote. When I saw this report as a national security lawyer, this did not look to me like part of what I think in terms of strategic decision-making to make declassification decisions consistent with the principles of intelligence transparency. This particular report, when it's talking about how U.S. intelligence would be helping in that very specific way, looked different and did not look like it was sort of part of the administration's plan to proactively and deliberately and thoughtfully release intelligence information. What guardrails are in place or should be in place to make sure that the intelligence information that is released, particularly when we're in the world is in the middle of an acute crisis, Ukraine in particular is in the middle of an acute crisis, what guardrails are in place to make sure that the transparency of the United States or our allies is productive and not counterproductive or damaging?
Well, I think first point is you have to think of intelligence in a combat situation as a weapon system. So when we give the Ukrainians Stingers, or we give them javelins, we give them long-range artillery, we give them counter battery or counter-fire radars, the Ukrainians don't have to come back and do Mother May Eyes on, hey, is it okay if I fire this Stinger at this aircraft or fire this javelin at this Russian tank? Well, so it is with intelligence. Once you've made the policy decision, you're going to share intelligence, particularly with someone who's in active combat, then you don't get to chaperone how they use it. Now, the particular New York Times article was a leak. It wasn't declassified. I really question it because, and subsequently in the first place, because I suspect that if, to the extent that the Ukrainians have been able to nail Russian generals, they've done that on their own. And primarily, I'm guessing, because the Russian generals were using their own private cell phones, you know, finding friends sort of stuff. So in a general way, I suppose U.S. intelligence, as it was shared with the Ukrainians, could have contributed to that because generals hang around headquarters buildings or facilities. But it's really tough to say, well, we're going to share this intelligence with you, but don't use it to sink ships or kill generals.
General Ashley, how do you think about the downsides? What are the risks involved, either in this particular report or more generally?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some, it's kind of a sensationalized reporting to a degree. It looks inflammatory. It makes for good press. I'll kind of leave it at that. But when you're in those inner circles that Director Clapper's been in the past, you have to kind of lay out the possibilities, and he's exactly right in that you cannot account for every utilization of that information to say, well, you can use it for this, but you can't use it for that. And you have to realize how dynamic things are in combat and on these various battlefields. And I think John Kirby, when he made the comments with regards to those accusations that we provided the information to be defensive in nature, to allow the Ukrainians to be able to defend themselves, and part of that defensive approach is that they understand where Russian forces are. Now, whether there's going to be a general officer at a headquarters, there's a high probability that there probably will be. That's kind of how they operate. But you can't over-engineer the release of the information. You've got to do it with the intent that it's going to be defensive in nature, and it allows them to protect their forces, and that at some point that's about as far as you potentially can carry that.
So we're going to start to wind down our conversation, and I appreciate both of you sticking with us, and I appreciate our audience sticking with us through this conversation. One of the bigger pictures in terms of the intelligence community's ability to function going forward that I just want to get both of your thoughts on is in order to be able to do this work, in order to be able to have information to be transparent about, in order to be able to have the kind of effect that intelligence can play that we've been talking about, the intelligence community needs authorities, legal authorities, to be able to collect it in the first place. And it needs to be resourced, and it needs its workforce to be resourced and trained. For many years, I would think probably for most of your careers and for the early part of mine when I was in government, there was somewhat of a bipartisan consensus in terms of support for intelligence community work, support for national security community in general. And I observe, and feel free to disagree with me, or I welcome your comments, but I observe that in the last few years, that bipartisan consensus seems to be eroding some, particularly as it has related to the surveillance debates and surveillance authorities. My question for you is, it seems to me that the information the intelligence community has, the US intelligence community has been able to provide as this war has unfolded in Ukraine has really demonstrated the incredible value that US intelligence provides. The work that the intelligence community workforce is doing has a real impact and is valuable. How do, Director Clapper, I'll start with you and then I'll go to General Ashley, but what is this recent experience in terms of how the US has been able to share information publicly, how it's been able to declassify information? Director Clapper, what does that say to you about the value of the intelligence community writ large? Do you think that we can, is it fair to draw the connection between the information that's been declassified, the information that has been revealed to the world to help better inform its understanding of Russia's aggression against Ukraine? How do you assess that that demonstrates just the important role that the U.S. intelligence community plays in the work that folks are doing?
Well, I think it amplifies the importance. The very thing we're talking about, to the extent that U.S. intelligence contributed to the sinking of the Moskva or getting rid of generals, I think in the minds of many people that shows the utility of U.S. intelligence and what it's doing to help the Ukrainians. I was fortunate enough to get invited in last week for an update on all this, and it to me is eye-watering what the U.S. is sharing on a timely basis with the Ukrainians, and you know, just to help them in their day-to-day combat activities, and that's all to the good. And I think, I mean, we can talk about, that's another subject, but there's a bigger battle here than just, you know, Russians invading Ukraine. It's larger than that. And so I think this shows the utility, and you know, polling information I've seen it reflects that. The United States spends a lot of money on intelligence, a lot of taxpayer money. So to the extent that taxpayers can be assured and be shown the value of intelligence and its utility, that's all to the good, and it certainly imbues trust and confidence, as Bob alluded earlier, which is all important.
General Ashley, how do you think about the current situation in respect to how it demonstrates the value of the intelligence community workforce and the importance of that work continues and is resourced and is given legal authorities that it needs to do its job?
I mean, I think it does validate it. I mean, everything Director Clapper talked about, you know, and having been part of this community for over 3 decades, for Director Clapper for 5 decades, you know, when you have the perturbations of a Snowden or something along those lines, and people question, you know, the surveillance and other things that are ongoing, you know, the people that are part of the IC or your brothers, your sisters, your friends, your aunts, your uncles, and every day they go in, and the responsibility and the lift that they take on for your own national security is incredible. So this is just an incredible community of patriots that work very, very hard to help senior leaders reduce uncertainty and make decisions. And so you know, it's incredible what they do. I have always felt that we've had good support from the oversight committees. They hold us to task, as they should. If you go back and you look at, you know, what took place in the 70s and why we have the oversight committees, but that relationship and the dialogue is one that's been important, and it's ongoing. The other thing that I would highlight, you know, and it made me think about it when Director Clapper talked about he got a, you know, kind of behind closed doors update recently, is as much as we've talked about, well, we're disclosing this information, we're releasing information, we're declassifying. I would say probably what's been released or shared or declassified is in the single-digit percentage, and it's probably less than 5. It's probably more like 1 or 2. And then that other 96, 97, 98% of the information that is helping drive operations and helping understand what's taking place and working with our allies and partners is not going to be disclosed. And so this is just a fraction of the information that's coming out because it serves a purpose, and you know, and the politicians of the world, and it serves an operational purpose for what we're able to do to help our Ukrainian partners, and that's done in conjunction with allies. And so there's still an incredible, it's like the iceberg. There is so much underneath the water in terms of intelligence and what's been going on between nations to help the Ukrainians and to help other partners globally across all the combatant commands in terms of what we think about when it's in the context of great power competition. As General Milley said, you know, he said the pipeline has been turned on to the Ukrainians. I think there are lessons to be pulled out of this as we think of the larger kind of the geopolitical global issues and how we work with partners moving forward as we get into competition with China and Russia, because most of that competition is going to take place well before the first shot is fired.
Well, I think that's a good note to leave you. Hopefully I'll be able to bring you both back for a conversation on those issues sometime in the future. General Bob Ashley, former Director of National Intelligence, Jim Clapper, I want to thank you so much for lending your many years of expertise and service to this conversation. For those of you who joined us for the conversation, thank you for sticking with us. In just a few minutes, CNAS will be hosting its last virtual session of today, which is on U.S.-China policy in the balance, and that panel will begin at 3:30. Thanks so much for joining us. And again, Director Clapper and General Ashley, thank you so much for your time today.